All right, welcome back everyone to another explainer. Today we're doing something highly focused. We're doing a micro deconstruction of a single, highly technical human resources metric. Now, on the surface, this data might seem straightforward, maybe even a little dry, but as we unpack this source material, we're going to reveal the very real, very human architecture that exists right underneath the corporate data. We'll look at how organizations measure departures, how they categorize them, and how they stretch those numbers over time to tell a story about their workforce. We're relying entirely on a specific set of organizational data points today, and we're going to pull them apart piece by piece. So let's get focused in, because we're going to decode exactly how a company tracks its most difficult workforce changes.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, defining the metric.
Here is the term exactly as it appears in our source material: total involuntary attrition. The definition they provide is, well, almost circular in its simplicity. It's just the total involuntary attrition of an organization, right? It's super formal, it's sterile. It's a classic piece of corporate jargon, perfectly designed to be dropped into a spreadsheet or, a board deck. When you hear the word attrition, you usually think of a natural wearing down over time, right? But the absolute key word here is involuntary. This isn't someone retiring or leaving for a cool new opportunity. No, this is a deliberate, structural metric. The source material is giving us the highest level, most detached view of this concept first. It's a really clinical term for a deeply complex reality. But we absolutely have to understand this jargon because this is the exact language that data systems and leadership teams use to communicate about structural workforce changes.
Now let's shift gears a bit. Section 2, the core question. The source material doesn't just leave us hanging with involuntary attrition. It actually translates it into this incredibly direct question. How many employees were asked to leave the organization? It totally strips away all that corporate polish. There is zero ambiguity here. This is the bedrock of the data. When an HR department or an executive team is looking at their total involuntary attrition, this plain English reality is exactly what they're measuring. And man, it's a heavy question. Being asked to leave encompasses a whole variety of really difficult organizational decisions. By putting this question right next to the formal terminology, our source material is basically demanding that we understand the human weight behind the data point. It's not just a statistic. It's a literal count of individual people whose employment was actively terminated by the organization.
So how do we actually answer that start question? The source states we must calculate the total number of involuntary attrition. And what this tells us is that answering the core question requires a specific, deliberate process of calculation. It is not an estimation. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a strict aggregation process where every single instance of an employee being asked to leave absolutely must be accurately captured, categorized, and then added up to find the exact comprehensive total for the entire organization.
Which brings us to Section 3, numbers versus ratios.
Now, what's really interesting here is how our source material breaks the output down into two distinct formats: a number and a ratio. Let's bounce between these two concepts for a second because they tell completely different stories. A flat number gives us the absolute volume. If the number is 50, that means exactly 50 people were asked to leave. It's a hard, immovable fact. But the ratio, that gives us the proportional context, which is absolutely crucial. Look at it this way. 50 people leaving a 100-person company is a massive structural event. That's a 50% ratio. But 50 people leaving a 50,000-person global enterprise, that ratio is just a tiny fraction of a percent. The source highlights both because you absolutely need both to understand the reality of the workforce change. The number gives you the scale of the action, while the ratio gives you the scale of the impact on the organization.
Let's move along and see how this builds in Section 4, tracking over time.
This timeline brilliantly illustrates the cadence of corporate reporting. Watch how this data builds. First, we look monthly, a one-month isolated view just to catch immediate spikes or short-term actions. Then the scope widens quarterly, over 3 months, smoothing out those monthly anomalies to show broader seasonal trends. Next, it escalates to year-to-date, or YTD. This is constantly accumulating the totals from day one of the fiscal year right up to the present moment, giving leaders a running tally of their workforce decisions. And finally, yearly, the complete one-year comprehensive retrospective. Do you see how the pacing of this data works? Monthly gives you the tactical view, quarterly gives you the strategic view, YTD keeps you accountable in the present, and yearly gives you the historical record. By tracking the numbers and ratios across all 4 of these distinct points, an organization builds a complete, undeniable picture of exactly how and when they're asking people to leave over the course of a fiscal year.
So, the crucial point is, let's review the steps required to lock these elements together into a single, cohesive measurement system. Step 1, you must identify the core data by answering that blunt question we talked about: who is actually asked to leave? Step 2, you take that raw data and formulate it. You express it both as a hard number for absolute volume and a proportional ratio for organizational context. Step 3, you plot that formulated data across time, tracking it monthly, quarterly, YTD, and yearly. This three-step process is exactly how a vague concept like attrition gets crystallized into a hard, actionable, and trackable corporate metric. It's basically a perfectly structured system for monitoring organizational change.
Which brings us to our final thought. We've deconstructed the jargon, we've looked at the numbers versus the ratios, and we've tracked the timeline. But, data doesn't exist in a vacuum. Based on these metrics we've just explored, I want to leave you with this provocative question to consider. What is your organization's total involuntary attrition ratio saying about its culture right now? Are the monthly numbers spiking? Is the yearly ratio higher than it should be? Remember, behind every single digit in that ratio is an actual human being who is asked to leave. How an organization measures this and what those measurements reveal really tells you everything you need to know about the reality of working there. Thank you for joining me for this focused explainer. Keep analyzing, keep questioning the metrics, and I'll see you next time.